back here in the place that I really enjoyed studying and met some really lovely people. So it's good to be here. So let me introduce you to Jessica. So Jessica is 23 years old. She's a university graduate. She's employed 4 days a week as a graphic designer. Her boss and her co-workers describe her as friendly and creative. She lives in a flat with two others around her own age. She regularly attends church, and she's on the roster to play the piano for the worship once a month. So that's one side of Jessica. There are other parts to Jessica, though, that maybe people don't see initially. Jessica has been diagnosed with major depressive disorder. She struggles to maintain her job. Every day is a struggle to get through, to get to work. She's very fearful of making mistakes at work, and it makes her feel very stressed, and she just doesn't really want to go most days. But then she's also fearful because she's got a lot of debt, that if she doesn't go to work, she will lose her job, and then that won't make anything any better. She stays home the 3 days that she's not working most of the time, apart from going to church, which she feels that she must do, or God will be really cross with her. And so she feels that that's necessary in her life. She mainly communicates with her friends on social media. She phones her mother at least once a week, but she times those so she only calls when he knows her dad will be out. On Sunday after church, after a particularly bad week, she decided to go forward for prayer. And unfortunately, the person that she spoke to was someone she didn't know, had never met before, and had told her that when she shared some of her story, that she needed more faith and that she should renounce the devil when she felt bad. So obviously Jessica wasn't too excited about that advice. In fact, it sent her into quite a spiral, which ended not very happily, as you can imagine. And so what I wanted to talk to you about is what we should and what we shouldn't do in response to people sharing that they're struggling with mental health issues. So that's people within the church and not within the church. But our focus is really on people who are already in the church, who already know the Lord Jesus as their Saviour, but still struggle with their mental health. And we know that that certainly is the case in our communities. So what's the problem with the approach of this particular man after church? Well, firstly, he didn't know the full story. He didn't know what she was going through. He didn't know her background, her situation, her relationship with her father, maybe what had happened to her in her life. It was also a one-off rather than an ongoing relationship. So there was no building up trust, no getting to know the person. It was just, this is what you should do, here's the advice. The approach only took spiritual factors into account, and we'll talk about a range of factors that contribute to depression and anxiety, and certainly spiritual factors are in there. But if we focus solely on them, we miss a large picture of what might be going on for the person. It's very simplistic. There was an implication it was her fault, she just needed more faith, and also assumed that she could in some way fix herself if she just got herself sorted out and managed the issue. So how big is the issue that we're talking about? So according to the ABS, or the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and I've only chosen stats for people around her age, depression among females 15 to 25 is 14%, and anxiety is 24%. So that's 1 in 4 females who have anxiety. Males, it's a little bit less, but it's still quite significant numbers. And as the years go on in the graph, generally it doesn't increase a lot, but it does, and it sort of, in terms of depression, it increases a little bit as people get a bit older, like in their latter twilight years as well. So you can see that there's quite a problem there, and obviously given those statistics, I'd be very surprised if there's anyone here who doesn't know someone, if they haven't themselves gone through depression or anxiety. You would all know somebody who's been through that. And so it's not a new idea. It's certainly something that's been around for many, many generations. And when we look back in the Bible, we can actually see evidence of it a very long time ago. So what is the cause of depression and anxiety. So the general cause, we would say, is because of the fall. So if we look back to Genesis 3, obviously there was an apple or whatever fruit it was that was eaten, and as a result, all sorts of negative feelings and experiences came into the world. So suffering, we often think about suffering as being physical, but it can be as easily psychological or spiritual as well. And so there's really no difference in terms of suffering, that the effects of the fall are the general cause of all the woes that we go through in our world. There are as well specific causes. So often, but not always, there are very identifiable causes. So if we actually spend time talking to the individual, sometimes we can find a reason for it. Sometimes we can't, and maybe that's because the person isn't sharing, or maybe it's just more to do with their biochemistry than it is to their life circumstances. But often we can see identifiable causes. All right, I'm going to keep going, but hopefully we'll catch up as we go. So how should we respond when we think somebody, or we know that somebody is experiencing depression or anxiety? So the first stage, so I'm just going to give you a sort of a bit of a process, and then we'll look at causes and cures in a bit more detail. So how should we respond? So engagement. So in order to respond well to somebody struggling with their mental health, it's important that we engage in a very non-judgmental way with them. We need to affirm them as an individual, not necessarily based on things that they've done or can do, but as a person of worth in their own right. We need to build a relationship with them and listen to what they have to say. So we're not quick to give advice, but we're really quick to listen and find out what is going on for the individual. Okay, then our next step is assessment. So we need to consider why this person is experiencing what they're experiencing. Now, there may be some obvious causes, but there may not be. But we do need to have a look at the situation, and we're not going to jump to conclusions like you don't have enough faith if we haven't actually found out what's going on in the person's life. So we do need to assess that. And we will go on to talk about different issues that we would be looking for. We need to consider the person's capacity to address the issues themselves. So is it something that they can work on themselves, or is it something that they actually need support from other people to be able to deal with? And also, what about yourself? What can you provide? What can't you provide? And the last thing we want to do is promise people that we can provide them with a lot of support that we actually can't follow through on. Okay, next slide. Or a couple down. So if we go to the one with the smiley faces. That one. Okay. So how we should respond depends largely on the severity of the situation. So obviously someone who's healthy or only has very, very mild concerns about the way they're coping with life, we can assist them with just caring for themselves, and maybe even just things like social support, stopping them from being lonely, etc., might actually be sufficient. But if someone's mental health is very concerning, so more down this end of the slide, professional care is likely to be needed. So we do need to consider the way that we approach things in relation to knowing how much of a problem what the person is experiencing is, and tailoring what we do to that. Okay, the next one. So we need to develop a plan, which, now we don't have to, sit down and write out a plan, but in our mind, when we're working with this person, we need to be thinking, what is it that I can do, or what is it that I can assist them to do to help them to deal with the situation? It's important that we anticipate any barriers that might arise and look at how they can be responded to, as well as being really specific about what we will and won't be able to do, and what they are expected to do for themselves. So we don't want people to become necessarily dependent on us, but we do want to be able to help people to meet their needs and to deal with the issues they're experiencing. So on the next slide, we'll think about physical issues. So if we think about mental health issues as having causes, having cures. There are three facets of that I want to look at. So the first one is the physical. So these pertain obviously to our physical body. And so there are a number of different aspects that have been found to be problematic for people who have depression or anxiety. So there's neurochemical dysfunction. So we know that some people might not produce enough serotonin or dopamine, etc. And so there are a range of things that can happen there. It's very unclear from research how that happens, so whether some people are born with less of an ability or whether life circumstances actually causes that to become an issue in people. Hormonal disturbances is another one. So those of you who are women, married to women, have sisters, daughters, might know that sometimes there's certain periods of time where women can be a little bit more irritable, a little bit more down, and certainly that can be related to hormones. I have a friend who's going through, I'm sure you're all nudging your wife at the moment, but my husband would do that if he was here. And I've got a friend who's going through menopause at the moment, and her mood swings are unbelievable. And she went from being quite a very stable, emotionally competent woman to being this woman who's just thrown by things that, and I think, the hormones have a big impact on it. It's not just that she suddenly can't cope with things. There's something more than that going on. Substance abuse can have an impact on us as well. When I was working at Teen Challenge, ice became a big issue, and what we found was it was quite predictable how people's depression levels would decrease when they were coming off substances. But with ice, people's depression levels didn't decrease in the expected pattern. So obviously something was happening with the brain after they used that substance that prevented it from recovering as quickly. Certain illnesses as well can lead to the symptoms of depression and anxiety. Glandular fever, there's a number of different thyroid conditions, there's a lot of different ones. As well as allergies, sometimes people with allergies can find that it increases their anxiety. Or make them feel more lethargic or depressed or confused. Nutritional deficits is another one. A lot of research has gone into what nutrients we particularly need in our diet. And unfortunately, junk food tastes far too good, and so some of us don't get the nutrition that we need. Sedentary lifestyle, again, lots of research about how exercise can help us. And those of us who sit behind an office desk all day, it's maybe a little bit harder, but certainly exercise. In fact, exercise has been found in lots of studies to be equal to antidepressants in terms of how much people's depression allays, which is quite amazing. Lack of sleep and environmental pollutants. So what does the Bible say about physical cures? Now, I couldn't see any physical cures for depression or anxiety in the Bible, and if you think of one, let me know. But I did see a number of physical cures for physical ailments. And if we think of depression and anxiety as a physical illness, a physical difficulty, then I don't see why God wouldn't allow us to use physical cures for them. So we have the example in Luke 10, we've got the bandages and the ointments that were wrapped around the wounds of the Good Samaritan, the guy that had been attacked. Paul tells Timothy to use wine for his stomach. In Hezekiah had the cake of figs for his boil, and obviously a cure for exhaustion for Elijah was being fed and given sleep. And who could complain about that if you're tired, eh? All right, so what about psychological? So we've looked at our physical body, but what about our psychological condition? So I've defined psychological as stemming from within the individual, though could also be the response of the individual to their social or environmental circumstances. So this might be a little bit much for you, but I did think, we're at Bible college, so I need to put some theory in there. So we could look at some different theories, psychological theories about why Jessica in this instance might be suffering from anxiety and depression. So from psychoanalytic theory, we'd say that her feelings of anger towards her father have turned inwards. Humanistic theory, her perceived failure to live up to her own expectations of herself. Cognitive theory, we could look at her negative belief systems about herself and the world. and behavioural theory, who learnt behaviour from reinforcement or social modelling. So there are a lot of different explanations for why people suffer from depression and or anxiety. In the case of these ones here, I probably wouldn't go around diagnosing people with those things. I think that's really to be left to a counsellor to sort out. But there are certainly a lot of different theories around why we suffer from these sorts of issues and how we deal with them and how we move forward from them. I don't know whether you've ever thought much about what the Bible says about the psychological issues that lead to depression and anxiety, but there are actually quite a few. Although the word depression and anxiety are not usually mentioned, it would usually talk about being low in spirit or different ways that it would determine it. It doesn't actually use the term depression or anxiety, but I wanted to go through some of those. Now, in terms of going through them, I'm certainly not advocating that you accuse people of having this issue. So the first one there is concealment of sin. Now, if I say to you, young man, sin in your life, that's not being very compassionate. We need to actually look at the person as a whole, and it might give us information about what's going on for the person, but it's certainly not something that we accuse the person of or deal with it that way. Here are some things that the Bible indicates can be a problem. It can also be a cure for feeling low and anxious. So the first one there is from Proverbs 28, and that's concealment of sin. So certainly if we have a sin in our life that we are not prepared to acknowledge and deal with, then obviously that can impact on our mental health. And the cure for that is to confess our sins to God and to one another as necessary and as appropriate, and deal with those things. If we have some guilty secret, then certainly getting freedom from that will have an impact on our mental health. The second one, from Genesis and Psalms and other places, is guilt about sin. And so it's good for us to be convicted of sin, and that's obviously one of the jobs of the Holy Spirit, but we also don't want to dwell on the guilt that comes from that. And Satan certainly is very keen to keep reminding us, as is our own human mind, of the things that we've done wrong. And a sense of guilt is something that people with depression and anxiety often talk about as being one of their symptoms, that they just feel guilty for no reason. And so we're told in 1 John 1:9 that if we confess our sins, then God will forgive us, and we can accept that. We don't need to keep going round and round in our mind of these things that maybe we think, well, God can't accept me or love me because of this. Well, actually, no, if we believe the words of the Bible are true, then God does forgive us and takes it as, what does he say, as far as the east is from the west. All right, the next one is unforgiveness and bitterness. And there's certainly lots of places in the Bible where unforgiveness is talked about as being an issue. And interestingly, it's something that psychological research has looked into a lot and found that people who have bitterness in their life towards someone, their mental health is significantly worse than people who are forgiving. So the Bible tells us to forgive those who hurt us. Now we know that that's not as easy as I forgive them. And sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. And sometimes that can be quite a process for people to go through. But it certainly has a huge impact on people's mental health when they stop holding on to things that are of concern in that regard. Now, lack of faith. One that I don't like the idea of, because I think it's been used quite badly within the church to accuse people of it being their fault. If they're even not well in a physical sense or in an emotional or mental sense. But there is some evidence in the Bible that the more faith we have, the better we will generally feel. And so we are told to draw near to God and have faith in God. I would say myself, when I have struggled with depression and anxiety, though, I always believed that it would end, that God would deal with it, but just not yet. And so having that faith that maybe it's only temporary can be helpful, but not everyone has that, and that's okay as well. Negative thinking is something that Philippians talks about a fair bit, and we're told not to dwell and complain and think about bad things, but to think about good things, to renew our mind. And again, when we think about cognitive theory, that's essentially what that's about. It's about having an accurate picture of the world, that our thoughts about the world are not necessarily unrealistically positive, not like, you walk down the road and find $1 million, that would be nice, but it's not an unrealistic positive idea. It's being accurate, because quite often our negative or problematic thinking is not actually accurate. It's blowing things out of proportion. It might be, the saying, turn a molehill into a mountain. So seeing situations as particularly bad when maybe, yes, there are some concerns, but maybe it's really not as bad as we think. So renewing our mind and focusing on different thoughts. If something's really bad and we're really worried about it, it doesn't help us to keep thinking about it. And so the Bible does tell us, just change that. Don't think about it in that way. Rebellion and disobedience can also, the Bible tells us at times, can lead to confused thinking and difficulties. So obviously, if we obey the Lord, hopefully things will go better for us. Again, there's lots of examples of where in the Bible people have obeyed God, and it doesn't mean that everything went really well for them. So these aren't formulas that we can just put in place, and they make a huge difference. So Romans 1 talks about being ungrateful, and Thanksgiving can be a really powerful way of dealing with our negative feelings and emotions, identifying the things that are going well in our lives, even very simple things sometimes. I can get out of bed, or I washed up the dishes today, or it doesn't have to be amazing things. I don't really like washing the dishes, that's why my mum's laughing. But yeah, just the simple things, and being thankful for the things that God has given us and done for us, because God has done some amazing things. And so redirecting and refocusing our thinking on those things rather than on the problems that we have can be really helpful. Jealousy and selfish ambition. So it is good that we humble ourselves. Trying to please others is another thing mentioned in the Bible that can lead to anxiety and depression. And I'm sure all of us that have ever tried to please everybody in a situation will know how anxious producing that can be. And Hebrews tells us instead to focus on pleasing God, because that's far more important in the long run. Matthew talks about worrying about not having enough, and that can lead to anxiety as well. And we're told there to have faith that God will provide. Now, it's really easy to run through a list like that and say, right, well, you guys go and do that and tell everyone else to do that and you'll all be fine. But it's really not that simple, is it? There are a range of situations in our lives that make it more difficult for us to do some of those things. I wanted to look at a few other factors that research has shown have an impact on our experience of life. One of those is social media. So we all see articles, I'm sure, about how much of a problem social media is causing for people in relation to their mental health. Thinking back to Jessica, she was only talking to people really on her mobile, her friends, which makes it hard for people to know how the other people are going if you are not actually talking to them. So that makes it difficult not only to know how people are going, but also for them to be honest about how they're going. We live in a society where we're very concerned about what people think of us and what they see. So if we think about social media, how many photos were taken to get the perfect image. I know that there are a lot of people in my Facebook feed who are going really, really badly in their lives, but you would not know it from their Facebook. It's all about how wonderful things are, and the photos of going out here, there and everywhere with the family. It doesn't matter that they all fought all the way there. There was this one amazing picture, and then people look at that and think, oh, that's everyone else has got it together except for me. But that's really not the case. And so I think that it's much easier for us to compare ourselves unfavourably with people in that situation, and I don't think it's a particularly healthy way for us to interact. Having said that, Facebook has some wonderful, and the other social medias have some wonderful features as well, but it is how we use them, and unfortunately for younger people who don't have different points of reference, sometimes that can be a really big issue. Consumerism is a big issue as well. Been doing some research lately into this issue, and what's found quite consistently is that the more you love possessions or the more you value possessions, the less healthy you are mentally. Like it's really quite amazing, the correlation, rather the inverse of that. And so it's quite scary actually. The more we value, the more we want to purchase, the more concerned we are about having the money to be able to purchase, which then of course comes into debt. You know, if we go into debt to buy these things because we really value them. And so it's quite a nasty spiral that people go into. And so a lot of consideration around, well, which comes first? Is it that the desire for things is part of, you know, not wanting to show parts of your life? We'll focus on things rather than who we are, or is it that it's the other way around? But it's certainly a very big issue, and certainly the amount of debt. I don't know what the exact figure is at the moment, but the amount of debt people have is huge. And it's very scary to think how people are ever going to get out of that, and concern about that. And now with the economy the way it is, that certainly will be leading to a lot of people having far more anxiety about not having enough and being able to meet their debts and whatnot. So I sort of expect that that will have an impact on a lot of people over the coming months. Another one that's a concern is body image, particularly again for younger people, but not only. A lot of people are very concerned about maybe the way they look or the way that other people think they look. And certainly with teenage girls particularly, that's a huge issue that we have. I don't think that's helped much by the types of magazines and things. I was standing buying my groceries the other day, and I was just amazed by the range of magazines in front of me, you know, all very airbrushed, everyone looked amazing. And then there was all these really, you know, lose 10 kilos in 1 week. And, you know, I mean, it was just ridiculous, the things that were on this magazine, and so this is what you had to do. But then what was even funnier was that next to it was all the chocolates that were discounted. And I thought, right, so you just give up on that and you eat the chocolate? I'm not really quite sure. I thought that was a bit funny. And I think it's funny too that the magazines that promote lots of weight loss also have like chocolate cake recipes and things like that. I don't know what's going on there either. I think that's a bit strange. Relationships are another area that's a big concern for people. Certainly families are not what they once were. I grew up with my mum and dad together. It's becoming far, far less common. And I think that there is a lot of stability that comes with that. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with step-parents, but it can bring a lot of damage and a lot of hurt. I have 2 stepdaughters, and on one hand I'd say I don't know that they were too damaged by their parents' divorce, but in other ways I can see that they were, you know, and the grief and the loss that they've been through and the experiences that I'd love them never to have had. But you can't control that always. But we certainly, it is a concern, relationships. And into that too comes domestic violence, which is obviously a massive issue, as is bullying in schools. Our individualism in our culture, helicopter parenting, insecure employment, our cognitive style and unforgiveness. Another thing that I've noticed in research too is, did you know that commuting is really bad for your mental health? I need a new job when it's closer to home. But yeah, it's amazing how much these types of things, and so when we think about our culture and things that we see as quite common and quite okay in our culture, and probably we don't think about what impact are they having on our mental health and on the mental health of the young people that we might encounter and work with. Unfortunately, though, a lot of them are not things that have quick fixes. We can't single-handedly change the magazines that are at the Woolworths counter. And so it really becomes a question of, well, what can we do? So we went back at the beginning, we talked about different steps that we could take in working with an individual. And most of us are more likely to be working with individual people or our loved ones as one-on-one or in small groups, rather than trying to change society as a whole. But we can mediate some of the difficulties that come in as a result of it. So when one example is when I talk to young girls, I try really hard, I don't make any comment about their physical appearance, because I don't think that that should be the first thing that I say to them. I don't think they should feel like I care one way or other about that. Rather, my focus is on their character and the things that they're doing in their life and the way they're doing things. And that can be hard because we live in a society that's so focused on appearance, and you know yourself, people will comment, and there's nothing wrong with commenting, but it's about what are we focusing people on, what are we encouraging them and saying is the most important thing about them, and we need to be really careful what it is that we focus on when we're talking to people. All right, so spiritual. So we've talked about physical issues, psychological issues and spiritual issues. So spiritual issues are forces of a spiritual nature that are outside the individual but impact on the individual. So there are two types that I can see in the Bible. One is caused by God. So there's some evidence of God using mental health issues in certain ways. One example obviously is in Daniel of when Nebuchadnezzar became like an ox, which is actually a particular mental health issue, not but and so God did do that. The other one is caused by demonic oppression or possession, and certainly there's plenty of evidence of stories in the Bible where demonic oppression has caused issues for people's physical and or mental health issues, and so certainly we can pray to deal with those issues, and in some ways they're actually easier issues to deal with when we think about the spiritual aspects that we can pray, and we have a lot of power in the name of Jesus. But when it comes to the deep-seated psychological issues, it's actually a little bit harder to deal with. So in terms of the Bible, have you ever noticed how many people in the Bible had symptoms of depression and anxiety? So I have a list there, and you can ponder the different ones as to what they went through at different times. A very popular story, I guess, would be Elijah after he'd been dealing with Jezebel and what was happening with the prophets of Baal, and he went to hide under a tree, and he was fed and had sleep, and certainly there was no evidence that God was angry with him in that scenario. Rather, he sent ravens, was it, to feed him. Yeah. David, certainly when we read David's Psalms, there's a lot of evidence of him having quite down times. Jeremiah, he wasn't the happiest person. Paul as well. I was a little bit concerned when I looked at it initially to think that most of the examples were in the Old Testament. That's a bit concerning, but I think it's more to do with the fact that we get stories of more people in depth in the Old Testament rather than that people in the New Testament didn't suffer. And certainly Paul had a miserable existence in some ways. And certainly there are some examples there where he doesn't talk in a very happy way about things that were going on. So I guess my question about people in the Bible who have experienced mental health issues is, what do we learn about God's response to those issues? Well, firstly, we learn that God dealt with each person differently. And so if we go through those stories and look at God's response, it's not the same every time. We also don't get the idea that it's sinful to suffer from the symptoms of depression. Psalm 34:18 says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." And we also know from 2 Corinthians 12 that being or becoming a Christian or a believer does not guarantee the experience of happiness or exemption from suffering. Now, wouldn't that be nice? I think it would be nice. I don't know. I think it would be hard for us to relate to other people in this world if all our difficulties disappeared the day that we became a Christian. There are also lots of examples of suffering saints of today. Now, I probably shouldn't have said today because some of those people are really not around anymore. John Wesley, but compared to the Bible, it's closer to today, of modern times, maybe I should change it to. But there are certainly plenty of them. Charles Spurgeon, amazing levels of depression and anxiety that he experienced. Apparently he could only be in the pulpit about 3 months a year, and the rest of the time he was fairly bedridden and unable to do much. And there are certainly other examples there people who have been through really, really down times. And so it's certainly not something that Christians are exempt from, which I'm sure you knew that before you came. I know you didn't need me to say that, but sometimes informing people that that is the case is actually really helpful. I remember one particular person I was working with, and we were talking about the Bible, and I was showing some of these examples in the Old Testament of people who really struggled, but they were people who went on to do amazing, amazing things for God. And for that person, that was really what they needed to hear, because they sort of felt that they were disqualified from being able to be somebody of significance to God because of the mental health issues that they were experiencing. But that's not the case. In fact, if we look at the Old Testament, what we see is really, really flawed individuals who have had very significant issues, who have gone on to do amazing things. And so that can be such an encouragement to people, just learning the stories and not just knowing about David beating Goliath, but knowing about David's full journey and all the things that he experienced, his feelings, his emotions, the Psalms he wrote, so that we actually have a true picture of people. And sometimes I worry a little bit in Sunday school and children's church, what do we teach? Is it just the epic battle or the David and Goliath, or do we actually teach about the suffering and the difficulties? Obviously in an age-appropriate way, but it is something that we do need to be mindful of. Another thing found in a lot of research is that we can cope with suffering better when we find meaning in our suffering. So when we feel that there is some reason for our suffering, we generally cope better, and that's been found a lot in research. People who then go on to, run a foundation or use that experience to help others, etc. And there's also, I like 2 Corinthians 4:16-18 that says, "Therefore, do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For our light and momentary troubles," which if we think about what was happening there, I don't know that they were light and momentary in their eyes. "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal." And how amazing is that motivation for the difficulties that we go through? It doesn't diminish them, though, but it does help us to look beyond them. So what does the Bible say are the benefits of suffering? So we're told in 1 Peter it strengthens our faith. In John, that God's work can be displayed through our suffering. James tells us that we can develop patience. Don't ever pray for patience, though. You want as little trouble as possible, not as much. I remember a guy who prayed once for patience, and he lost his job. Everything went wrong for this guy for the year, and at the end of it, he said, "God, I don't want patience anymore." But I'm sure he learned patience through it all. 2 Corinthians, to foster dependence on God and to identify with others who suffer. And I would have to say that I thank God, particularly that I have experienced periods of depression and anxiety, because I think I'm a person that if I hadn't, I probably would have struggled to understand that people can't just get up and get going. I'm fairly driven in general, but certainly during those periods, I just couldn't do the things that I would normally have done, and I didn't enjoy things and I didn't feel good. And I really thank God that I went through that, because I think that it is hard to understand when you haven't. All right, so I want to tell you about a particular website that would be quite useful to you, and that's the Mind and Soul Foundation. I don't know if anyone's heard of that before. It's a UK group that essentially work with churches around mental health issues, and they have a tremendous website which has incredible resources for pastors, just general Christians, about mental health issues, and it's really worth having a look at. They have some excellent video resources as well as written. It's quite amazing. And they have in particular a thing called the Mental Health Access Pack, which is designed for churches. And I really recommend having a look at that. So they have 5 practical tips on their website for helping people with mental health issues, and I think it's worth going through them. The first one is to consider the impact rather than trying to understand the complexities. So when we're working with someone or loving someone who has a mental health issue, it's not so much about trying to understand all the ins and outs and diagnose it, and it's just about, okay, so this is what you're experiencing, this is what you're having a problem with, what can I do to help? So what's the impact of that? So if you find it really hard to get out of bed in the morning, what can I do to help with that? So the impact of that might be, are you struggling to get the kids to school? Okay, who could help with that? So looking at what's the impact on the person's life rather than trying to understand all the ins and outs. And I think that's really quite powerful. Certainly when in a church, people have physical issues. We had someone recently who had surgery and the church cooked so many meals for them. But do we do that if people have mental health issues? Yeah. Sometimes I think we deal with those issues quite differently within the church, but are they any different? And so we do need to think about the impact and how we can be of assistance. The second tip that they talk about is journeying instead of judging. So it's not about whether the person's right to feel the way they do, whether it's their brain or it's their behaviour or it's whatever else it is. It's not about judging them, it's about journeying with them and helping them to find another way of dealing with the situation that they're in. The third one is to make sure people are getting the treatment they need and deserve. And that might seem a bit strange because I think we often within the church we say, well, they're accessing mental health services, so they must be getting the treatment that they need. That's not always the case. Our mental health system is quite flawed. They do a good job in many ways, but there are times when people do slip through cracks and things that there's a lot of room for advocacy if we are prepared to do that. We had a situation with a girl in our church who was in hospital with an eating disorder, and the hospital decided, I don't really know why, I wasn't there, but that they would put her in a ward. She was about 20, put her in a ward with 3 old men, essentially, old alcoholics. And one of our church elders was there and just said, no, you are not putting her in there. And he carried on, and if you knew this man, you would know that that would be a spectacle to see. But he really advocated and said, no, you are not doing that. And they did. They found another room and they sorted it out. But had he not been there and had he not spoken up, and sometimes I think it is tempting, you think, oh, well, they must be doing the right thing, we don't know. But sometimes we just need to say, well, actually, no, that's not fair, or that's not right. That person doesn't, or they do need whatever it is. And there have been a lot of occasions where I know of people doing that, and I've done that myself, where things have been missed. People have just not got what they need, and somebody else sort of saying, you need to deal with this, makes a big difference. And sometimes I think patients, particularly in inpatient services, feel very marginalised. They just, I'll just take your medication and go and be quiet, when actually there is an issue that really does need to be addressed. And sometimes you coming in from the outside have a much better ability to do that than the person inside does. The fourth one that they go through is, if in doubt, ask. No response does not mean no impact. And I couldn't quite understand what that meant at first. But what they were saying was, if I say to you, can I help with something? And you say no, it doesn't mean that me asking hasn't been appreciated. And so what they were saying was, we need to ask, we need to say, can I do something? Let me know if there's something I can do. Can I take you to this? Can I? And so often I think people stop asking because they keep getting rebuffed. The person says, no, or no, I'm fine, or no, it's okay. And so over time we stop asking. Now that doesn't mean we ask every day. We don't want to drive them batty. Bit of a topic. But we also want to let them know that we are still available, that we haven't given up on them just because they've said no a few times. And so it is important that we persevere. And that also leads into the fifth one, which is heaps and heaps of things in the first 2 weeks and then forget about them. You need to look at what you can actually do with the person long term, because it's not going to help them if you do a few things and then you disappear. It might help, but it's not going to help in the long term. And so it is important that we sustain and be able to be available ongoingly and look at what support can be provided. So the last slide, and I was making this slide at work today and everyone was laughing at me and my buckets, but I wanted to just talk really briefly about, I guess we would think about it in a psychological way as resilience, that we all have a different level of resilience. And the purpose of the buckets, which maybe went a bit overboard and put too many there, but I wanted to point out that we all are different in our ability to deal with life circumstances. And if we think about the size of our bucket as the size of our ability or our resilience when it comes to difficulties. So some people, you might think, why are they stressed? They've got nothing to be stressed about, but the simplest things can make them really stressed. And it may be just that they don't have good coping skills, that they don't have a lot of resilience, they have a small bucket. And then there might be other people, and I'm sure we've all been in a position where we've admired someone and gone, how on earth can they do that? You know, they've got 12 kids, they've got 5 jobs, they've got, I don't know, 4 horses. I mean, it's just, and then they run the church. Like, there are some people whose bucket is just ginormous and they just can keep putting stuff in it and keep going and it doesn't matter. But we're not all the same. We all don't have the same capacity. And so we shouldn't be judging other people by the size of their bucket. But we should be encouraging them and helping them to expand their bucket, not in a judgmental sense, but in an encouraging and a building up sense, so that other people get to the point, and we all ourselves, I mean, that's part of what faith is enlarging our bucket, our ability and our trust in God. And so we do need to be encouraging each other in that resilience and in the way that we can all cope with situations in a better